Today, we're digging into three forces colliding in the MSP market right now. Big money AI investment that could reshape competitiveness, the security first reality check coming out of Right a Boom, and the uncomfortable question underneath it all. What AI actually changes about staffing, skills, and service delivery? Seth Robinson returns to chat about these topics and answer your questions. It's Wednesday, February 4th, 2026, and I'm Dave Sobel. Welcome to the Business of Tech Lounge, the live version of the Business of Tech podcast. I take questions and comments throughout the show, so please submit them in the chat. If you have a question, we will happily respond to it. Now, thanks to ABC Solutions, a Business of Tech Plus supporting vendor, ABC Solutions specializes exclusively in accounting, supporting managed service providers and IT firms. Check them out at abcsolvesit.com. Our live stream support is provided by Rhythms, delivering 5G connectivity solutions for MSPs. Reliable internet access for everyone. Visit rythmz.com for more information. A reminder, we are watching that chat. We'll take your questions in real time. Joining me today is Seth Robinson, a leader in industry research and analysis at CompTIA. Seth tracks the trends shaping the IT space with research spanning security, cloud, IoT, and AI. He brings a broad, data-driven view of where technology is headed and what it means for service providers, and he is a frequent flyer here on the show. Seth, welcome back.
Dave, thanks for having me. I know we were supposed to have Carolyn with us too, and that was advertised, Carolyn April. So I'm glad that I can't see the number of viewers that we have because it's probably millions are probably dropping off the live stream, just disappointed that Carolyn's not here. But
I know she's sick today, sends her regrets, but we'll have you both on, I know, in sometime in March or April to revisit and mix that up. But Seth, you and I always have fun talking about these kinds of things, so I'm interested to dig in and get your take on a couple of issues.
Yeah, let's go.
So the first one I've been thinking about a lot, and I kind of wanted to get your take as somebody who observes this space from a data perspective. You're thinking a lot about staffing and the way IT is delivered. And so I think this one is kind of interesting. I'll frame it for our viewers. OpenAI has taken an equity stake in Thrive Holdings. Now, Thrive is a VC entity who is behind Shield Technology Partners, Shield being a fast-scaling AI-first MSP rollout. The idea is that the partnership structured in a way that allows OpenAI to embed their models directly into Shield's platform and have OpenAI engineers working inside of Shield to help AI optimize all of the things that they're doing. Now, Shield has rapidly acquired and integrate 9 MSPs, focused on the idea of a decentralized founder-led operations and their proprietary AI automation engines. They've done 2 $100 million funding rounds so far, one just recently announced. So, Seth, I look at this move and I say, okay, this is unique, right? We've had lots of discussions about traditional organic growth for companies. We've seen now the investment of private equity into the managed services space that's created roll-ups. But this feels a little bit different because this is a software vendor saying, I'm going to work directly with this company to do an experiment and try out the way we're going to do it to model that. Give me your take, thinking through that from a market dynamic perspective. Am I right to say this is different? And how different do you think it is?
So be patient with me here. I'll lay a little groundwork from my perspective. I think there's a couple of interesting things happening with AI. One of them has been happening for a little while, and that's this notion of consumer technology versus enterprise technology. We definitely saw this with mobility, right, and smartphones, where the best technology was all of a sudden getting developed for consumers because it was affordable enough to do that. Consumers could spend the money. It didn't have to be this massively expensive thing that was only for corporations and then trickled down into the consumer space. Once you start developing for the consumer space, then obviously a lot of people want to get into that enterprise market. That's where the big dollars are. And so I think we've seen that playing out over the past several years. The other thing that's kind of interesting, I think, with AI, similar but a little different, is there's a couple different flavors of AI out there, I think, that are on different adoption curves. One is individual use of AI tools, and that lines up with the consumer version of this thing. The other is getting AI integrated into a technology stack. And that's what we've seen over the past year, a little bit of this tension. And then some businesses saying, we don't know that we're quite seeing the value from AI. And we definitely see companies doing both of these things. They're trying to kind of get their entire workforce trained. They're also trying to get AI plugged into their technology stack and their workflows and all of their business systems. They're two very different things. OpenAI is kind of caught in the middle of, I think, both of these trends, right? They developed this amazing consumer product that's kind of for individual use, and now they're wanting to enterprise-ize it or enterprise-ify it or whatever you would say, right? They're trying to get into the enterprise. They're trying to figure out what's their path to monetization. And I think you see them trying several different things. And this to me comes off as one of the things they're trying. Like, hey, we've got a product here and we definitely have like some IP behind the product that we think can inform a lot of other things. What's the path here, right? What's the go to market or the go to enterprise for us to transition from kind of where we started and where we made a humongous splash into where we want to be, that's more of a sustainable model.
Okay, I love this framing because this really helps us understand a little bit of the way they're thinking about it. Because the consumer versus enterprise plays, I think, is a really great framing here. And I'll give a little bit of my perspective on background and we'll bounce this around. If I think about where you're exactly right, OpenAI kind of launched out of the gate with this consumer product. I mean, ultimately, they were a research lab trying things out. They launch a consumer product unexpectedly. You know, they get success with ChatGPT, and now they're looking around and saying, "Hey, what enterprise spaces can we move into?" I'm right on board with your framing there, and I think that's the pivot. And I think what's then additionally interesting is they when they looked out and they looked at all the potential industries that they could get into. Well, one of them that they circled very aggressively was IT services and managed services. Like they looked at across the landscape and said, okay, this is really interesting. This is an area that we can invest ourselves in, put our not only our money into it, but also our people and our particular technical know-how and implementation. Oh, and by the way, we're going to do it through this holding company. So I think that that's a really interesting play. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that Anthropic has typically been the perceived leader in enterprise adoption. They've been doing a really good job on their enterprise side here. So we've got that dynamic going on as well. I think the other thing that I'm curious to get to think a little bit more about is as we think about this, are you thinking about AI broadly in kind of the idea of the typical flywheel? And what I mean by this is that oftentimes when we think about, you try and build a system that gains speed through its repetitive use, right? And so the idea is the better you get with AI, the more data advantages you have, that then drives your ability to do more with AI. Like, do you see what we're talking about here in IT in general, IT services more specifically, as an area that can benefit from the AI flywheel? Or do you look at it and say, like, is this an area that because of its complexity will never truly get those benefits? Like, does that framing make any sense to you?
Yeah, it does. And I think that this lines up with another conversation that I was having this morning, that I think AI, more than a lot of the trends that we've had recently, even though a lot of these other trends have had some of this element to them, AI really needs to be defined in discussions, right? If you just say, I'm using AI to do this, what does that mean? Are you using an LLM? Are you using natural language processing? Are you using a chat bot? Is it integrated into a data analysis tool? What exactly does it mean? It can mean a lot of different things. And I think that that's part of the friction that's going to happen here as these adoption curves kind of make progress. Is you're going to have business leaders and executives saying, we want to be on the AI train. We want to capitalize on this. And then, down at the IT level or even the business unit level, they're going to have to define that a little bit more and saying, we are using AI to do this specific thing. We're using AI in a completely different way over here, right? And we'll probably start getting some terminology. I think that's already started happening But kind of like with cloud, even today, I think cloud is used as kind of a catch-all, but it doesn't take too long until, okay, what are we talking about? Are we talking about infrastructure as a service or software as a service? And I think the same thing needs to happen with AI. It's a little surprising that it hasn't already started happening even more up to this point. But I think for it to kind of gain the traction that you're talking about, we're going to have to get beyond this really high level umbrella term that's been around for decades and be crisp about what we're talking about.
Okay, I love the way you frame that because I think that allows me to sort of separate the. I'm with you on the cloud parallels. And let me use that parallel to draw it in and bounce an idea off of you. So I've always maintained the idea that I think the fact that cloud is a catch-all is fine because that's what customers use to refer to the technology, that space and that category, and it is up to both implementers and the vendors themselves to worry about, like, well, what does this specific matter mean? Like infrastructure as a service, or like software as a service, and all the various elements of that. Customers don't really care. Like, from their perspective, it's like, well, I just wanted cloud, right? I just wanted away from here and not here, and not on
Depends on who
prem.
you're talking about at the customer, but yeah, like especially the decision makers, that are probably driving the IT team, they're just using the term, right?
They're just using, and that's okay because they understanding enough of the concept to know what they to know the category, and they leave it to their specific people in their team and their partners to be smart about it. I'm actually comfortable enough with the idea of AI to say, look, I think I'm good with high level managers and broad business strategists having this big blanket term for the entire space, and then leaving it to the technology people to figure that out, assuming we're doing a good job of bringing those people into the loop and designing things well and implementing. I'm okay with these big broad categories as long as the implementers are left to put the guardrails on. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up AI governance in this stance here too, particularly as we're coming off technology like what's going on with OpenClaw, where I just watch personal agents running rampant across business environments and wreaking havoc. That's the use case for AI governance. I love your framing there, and I think that kind of differentiation is important. I'm going to use that actually to pivot to the second thing I wanted to ask you about, because I think framing and conversation is important. For listeners catching us on the live show today, you're getting a preview of what I'm going to drop on today's Business of Tech at 5 p.m. today. I cover the announcement Lexful is doing at Right of Boom. This morning at 9 a.m., they dropped a press release where they talked about their new AI documentation system for MSPs. I go into depth on it because I spoke with the CEO on the Business of Tech. That drops at 5 p.m. today, so you can get all the specifics about it. But Seth, for the purpose of this conversation, it's another story that's kind of parallel. They built this cool AI documentation tool. You'll want, as a listener, to dig into it and understand it. But rather than connect directly into the PSA and RMM, they're choosing to go in through ScalePad and LionGuard. And they're using those points as integration points to get access to the data. And this is interesting to me because, again, when we talk about integrations as a category, oftentimes we as owners say, well, we need our data integrated. Sure. And then we don't necessarily care about how that happens. This is where I wanted to get kind of your take on this a little bit is, hey, they're coming at this in a very different perspective and saying, we want to do our integrations via this other set of systems, not the typical entry points. When you think about the way software vendors talk about it, like, how much does that different integration points matter? And how much is it more about functionality? Like, are we trading, a different one set of dependencies for another, or are we making a system more brittle by coming in through that? Do you have a sense of the way that might be looking at?
Yeah, so a couple thoughts here on this. One that kind of ties our previous conversation into this one. So the tool that you're talking about, if a company is saying we need to get some AI in here, and then they're like, oh, okay, here we found this thing and it does AI, documentation, and it's like, okay, great. What was our documentation strategy before? that might not exist. I think that's one of the things that differentiates it from cloud a little bit is like with cloud, you could say like, this is how I'm running my infrastructure. There was always a way of running infrastructure before. And so now you're kind of able to compare. One of the things with AI is like, if it's a documentation strategy or a content creation strategy or whatever it is, if there wasn't a strategy there before, AI isn't going to solve that for you, right? And so just bringing AI in might not be the solve that the company needs. And that's where a little bit more detail and a little bit more granularity is needed. But then to your other point about where this is getting integrated, it makes me think about one of my favorite topics that I think I've talked about on this show before, and that's complexity. And my belief that the degree of complexity in business systems today is far, far greater by like orders of magnitude than a lot of executives or business decision makers might understand. And so I think what we're starting to see is like maybe different approaches that are offering avenues to reduce that complexity in different ways than might have been done before, right? And so yeah, for like an MSP or an IT leader, if they're looking at like all these tools that they have and how do they bring them in together, well, how does that work, right? And can I center around one area, or can I integrate in a different place, and then that puts my center of gravity over here, and that helps me to reduce complexity. I think that's one thing that's driving a lot of vendors to maybe try to take a different bite of the apple.
Okay. Now, by the way, Fred, if you're watching live and you want to throw a question into the chat, go ahead and do so. We'll take it in real time. Now, Seth, I gotta ask because you brought up this complexity question, and I love it, and so I want to follow on here a little bit. I love complexity, right? Because that is the area where you can manage it. You need to get there's governance concerns. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and you brought up the point of simplification. And the idea here is that we can take these complex problems and we can start simplifying it. Well, that said, the more I simplify the problem, the more I push it into the commodity space, right? If I get to the point where it is so simplified, well, it now becomes a commodity. I also know that I can't forever keep it at the right balance, right? I know I can, if I keep simplifying, I can't keep it in the middle space all the time, that I make the perfect amount of money because eventually it will be commoditized. How do you think about that balance? How do you think about the pathway of managing complexity, continually managing and bringing it down, but knowing that as you do that, you drive it into commoditization?
I think I think about it less as simplification and more about management. Like you know,
Okay.
the level of complexity is probably only going to keep growing. You know, AI is exacerbating complexity to a pretty significant degree. We're going to have more trends coming after that are going to just keep doing that. I don't know that we're going to get simplified, you know, or automation plays into this as well, right? You know, how much can you automate, which might be a form of simplifying, but it might also just be a form of management that like you've still got all the complexity, but you have to know all that complexity. You're not trying to reduce it down to something simple so that somebody could walk in off the street and manage, you know, the IT systems very easily just, you know, by pushing the easy button, right? I think the degree of complexity stays there, but it's about managing that complexity far more than I think has been done in the past, right? I mean, I think in the past it's been more, you know, when things were less complex, more of an ad hoc approach, right? And it's like I'm managing this and I'm managing this and I'm managing this, and it all kind of has to work together, but I've kind of got it all. And now it's massively complex. You've got business units with their fingers in the pie, and it has to be managed in some way. And in some cases, that might mean some simplification, but I would just be a little surprised, I guess, if it kept going down that simplification route, you know, all the way down to like a commodity, right? I think there's going to be that management in there. And it's kind of this, you know, margin in the mystery type of thing, right? I think there's going to continue to be a lot of opportunity to manage that and build best practices and help IT leaders and IT teams and MSPs deal with all of this new stuff that's come into their world.
Okay. So then I'm going to use that you brought up the MSPs themselves. I think you're the right person to have this conversation, which I keep tracking all over the web right now, as MSPs are debating what I'm calling the tier one question. You spent a lot of time, particularly with CompTIA, looking at job data, and they're looking at trends in employment and skills. So I think you're exactly the right person to weigh in on this. A lot of MSPs are hearing buzz around AI, and one of the buzz conversations is it's going to eliminate the tier one job. Right. The idea is that we're going to completely make the tier one job go away because we're going to deliver that with AI. This could go lots of ways in my perspective. Like, we could do it. It could be fully automated. We could be supplementing people. It could be a complete failure. You're looking at the data. You're looking at the research. Where do you weigh in on this tier one conversion to AI question?
Yeah, this is a huge topic, right? And it's not just like tier one support. It can be, entry level cybersecurity. It could probably
Mm-hmm.
be like entry level accounting. It's kind of this whole entry level, early career type of space that feels very threatened right now. And I think there are a couple thoughts that I have right off the bat. And so if we just, stick with tier one as the discussion point here, AI today might be able to eliminate some of today's tier one tasks and responsibilities. That just shifts what tier one means, right? And maybe to become a tier one support specialist means that you have to take more training because you're solving more difficult problems, because all of that is like moving up the stack. I think that's one thing, that's happening. I think another thing that's happening is that I was just reading a paper this week from the Economic Innovation Forum looking at this issue of entry level jobs kind of declining since the launch of these generative AI tools, and really debunking the myth that generative AI has been the driver of that because of the timing. Because a lot of companies would not have been able to implement AI in the time that it took them to reduce some of these job postings or even jobs at their company. And so their point, which I think is one that I buy into, is that this whittling down of the early career role has been happening for a while, as companies have been looking for that mid-career, more advanced, more specialized role. And what a lot of people are thinking is that, and I think we're starting to hear this from companies themselves, is they're almost painting themselves into a corner. So they're like, okay, so if I don't need a tier one anymore, or if AI can do my tier one, that's great. But then if I need tier two, where is that coming from? Right? Where would I get my tier two from? And so I think that, for one, the technology is going to shift job responsibilities. That's always going to happen. There's going to need to be evolution of skills and probably advancing of skills. But I do think that companies have to kind of grapple with, what does it mean to build a pipeline of talent? And how do we go about that? And what does that investment look like over the long term, right? Over the short term, that investment probably doesn't make sense if you can automate it or if you can do whatever. But over the long term, how does that play out, right? And having a long-term view is not always the thing that companies want to do, but I think we're seeing it more and more. And I think that this need to build pipelines, again, is something that every company is going to kind of have to sit down with and think through. What's our appetite for this? What's our risk, strategy? How do we evaluate this, and how do we move forward?
I think you hit on something really important there. It's the long term versus the short term, and one of the reasons why I continue to play in the small business space is that these are private companies, generally run by individuals or groups of individuals who actually can play the long game, who can play a long game and say, we are going to invest in 5-year kind of plans, not necessarily have to hit quarter to quarter metrics all the time. A lot of the headlines come from large publicly traded companies that are trying to play this at a quarter by quarter growth metric, and have to get on that up and to the right kind of line continually, where those of us in the small side can play a longer game. And I think you've hit the nail right on the head right there, in that we have to, in small business, we want to focus on investment in pipelines of people so that we continue to have that. And in fact, I think we're going to benefit from the fact that we can supplement our junior people with better tools, make them more productive, but also use those tools to help train them, help grow, give them access to better information, and make them better take those tier ones by giving them good tools and be able to handle a higher workload, be able to see the patterns better. I mean, I don't know about you, but one of the things that I look back at the early portion of my career is actually really a lot of the benefit was in getting just experience so that I can see patterns better. It's not necessarily the fact that I needed to learn an individual skill, it's that I needed to see the pattern to understand where that difference is. I know the other thing that you guys look at CompTIA all the time is kind of the fluctuation in job employment in tech. Can that tell us something about where we're at and like where we've been over the past, say, year?
Yeah, a couple points that you brought up there that I think are really interesting. Before I get to that question, your comment about the headlines of what's going on in IT versus the reality on the ground. I, I think probably even for a big company, you probably have a big CIO, that looks at a media story and says, well, if I ran my IT that way, I don't know if it'd go that great. And then that changes drastically when you get down to the SMB space, right? And we've always said that these are like two different worlds. And I think we're continuing to see that play out. And then your point about making things more efficient or making the workers more efficient or more productive. I think with tech support or with infrastructure or a data strategy or cybersecurity, any of these things, what we consistently see from companies is they're not where they want to be with those topics, right? And those disciplines and those operations within their organization. And they know that they can't just keep bringing in people, and probably letting go of people isn't going to help them. And so there's always the cost part of it. And with any layoffs that we read, cost is going to be the driving motivator there. Not shift in business or new technology or whatever. It's always going to be cost, but there is this question of like, are we as secure as we want to be? Are we managing our data as well as we want to be? And if not, how do we get there? Especially if we can't even find the people and we can't bring them in. We've got the people that we have. Let's use these tools to make them better. So I think that will be, a huge part of it. To your question about, what's going on with the tech jobs landscape, I was doing some presentations at the beginning of the year where I was pulling in the annual data of what we saw in job postings, and across all the disciplines, including software development, infrastructure, cybersecurity, data, it was relatively flat. You saw some tailing off at the end of the year, but you typically see tailing off at the end of the year as companies are starting to tighten their belt a little bit. I think this needs to be a multi-year thing that we're looking at, but I think even that flatness might surprise a lot of people who have been reading headlines and would have expected that, especially something like software developer might have just gone off a cliff last year in terms of job postings and what companies were looking for, and it didn't.
Well, in a way, I almost want to end right there because that's reassuring news. Despite all the noise, the data is saying flat, and that actually is really telling. Give me a little bit of an insight. What research are you working on, and what can we kind of expect in the coming, say, quarter or two for research you're working on?
Yeah, well, we've got our big State of the Tech Workforce report coming out that looks at a national level, a state level, and then many metro areas, looking at tech employment, tech industry employment, and what some of the trends are there. It's just a huge data pull that we do, and a lot of people find it very valuable. And then I'm going to be thinking a lot about workforce development and what some of the gaps are, because I think that we go out into these conferences, and whether we're talking about an MSP conference or an HR conference or a CIO conference, if you ask the question, do you want to upskill? Everyone says yes, right? But that's not the solution. There are hurdles and gaps that are keeping people from doing that upskilling, whether it's at an individual level or a corporate level. So I really want to dig into that more and find out what some of those gaps are and where training and certification can play a role in the strategies that organizations are trying to build.
Well, Seth, I am looking forward to those reports coming out and having you back on to talk a little bit more about it. So if people are interested in kind of weighing in or continuing the conversation, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
People can reach out to me at my email, srobinson@comptia.org. You can also find me on LinkedIn, where you may be watching this video. I'm on LinkedIn. I am the Seth Robinson that's with CompTIA.
Well, that makes it easy to find. Seth, always fun to have you on. Really appreciate it and look forward to having you and Carolyn back on when she's feeling a little bit better. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Dave.
Now, I want to tease an interview coming out this weekend. I was joined by Dr. Ashwin Mehta. He's the founder and CEO of Methodology. And we talked about why AI pilots often stall and the practical challenges of scaling AI in organizational settings. We talked about the hidden costs, data readiness issues, and the decision frameworks relevant for IT leaders and MSPs who are looking at AI adoption. Here's a preview of that interview. The other half of this that everyone keeps talking about is the data side. The both joy and struggle with what we're doing with some of the AI tools now is that they are great with unstructured data, disorganized data. But at the same time, there's often the thought of, well, how organized do I need to get of it? How much data do I need? I know you've challenged some of the ideas around here, particularly around the ideas of more data automatically means better. Help me understand the way you think organizations need to do data readiness in order to be ready for AI.
Yeah, so I think that many organizations start at this perspective, or this point, where they have lots of people who have lots of Excel spreadsheets in their OneDrives or Google Drives, and that's kind of what their data looks like. And that means you have potentially unstructured data, you have disparate locations, everything is basically everywhere. You might have duplications, you have different formats, even down to the point of saying, you're in the US, I'm in the UK. The way we write dates is different. Mm-hmm. So even down to that level, we'll have very different nuance in the data that we have. And one of the things nearly every company should be looking at, but needs to be proportionate to the level of the company, is how do we get our data in one place so that everybody is working from a single source of truth? If we think about finance in a company, you have a small or medium company, probably you have one source of accounts. You have a bank account, you know how much money is going in, how much is going out, what the invoices are, what you're selling. These kinds of things should be a single source of truth. There should not be discrepancies. You look at this system and we think we made $100,000. We look at this other system and we think we made 120. That shouldn't be happening. And we wouldn't tolerate that in the finance space. But when we look across some of the people side of things, maybe we have an HR system that has employee records in it. And maybe we have an IT system that has an Active Directory or something where you have a list of employees, contractors, etc. They should be the same. If they're not the same, then you have a discrepancy in the data. So it's very important for a company to get to the point where they are satisfied that they have a single source of truth for the data that matters.
Dr. Mehta got into specific ways that you can work on data governance. He talked about AI frameworks and the way you would want to implement it with customers. Business of Tech Plus subscribers get these interviews early in the dynamic ad-free feed. It's a benefit of supporting the show. Visit businessof.tech/plus to sign up and get early access. This interview will be released for everyone on the weekend. Again, I want to thank ABC Solutions, a Business of Tech Plus supporting vendor. ABC Solutions specializes exclusively in accounting, supporting managed service providers and IT firms. You can check them out at abcsolvesit.com. Our live stream support is provided by Rhythms, delivering 5G connectivity solutions for MSPs. Reliable internet access for everyone. Visit rythmz.com for more information. Vendors, you too can get your name mentioned on the live show. It's part of our vendor support level for Business of Tech Plus. If you, the listener, want to support the show and get even more from the Business of Tech, check out our membership options at businessof.tech/plus. There's a free tier with access to daily stories and transcripts, insider access for bonus analysis and early access to those interviews, and the leadership tier with exclusive vendor briefings, data reports, and behind-the-scenes insight into the channel. Every membership directly supports independent reporting and helps me continue bringing you research-driven coverage of the IT services industry. Again, that's businessof.tech/plus. If you have a question and are listening to the recording, send it in at question@mspradio.com or put it in the comments section on YouTube. Thanks for joining me for the Business of Tech Lounge, and I will see you next time.
Produced by Picture This Video. Part of the MSP Radio Network.